Elmwood Transcona.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm happy to contribute to the debate this evening on Bill C-14. For a long time, the NDP has supported the principle that Quebec should maintain proportionality with its seats at the same level. It's not the situation here in C-14, but we think that this bill is important for us not to step back so that we can have a debate on proportionality. So that's the value of this bill, and it's urgent because there's redistribution of electoral districts, and I think that we need to take a decision to make sure that the new seats in this process reflects the number of seats that we all want to see Quebec have in this process. It's urgent. We need to make a decision. It will not be a perfect decision, but it's a good decision given the context.
We've heard a lot about representation and some of the important principles that already undergird the Canadian electoral system. We know that in the House of Commons already that representation by population isn't the only consideration. Of course, we know, just for example, that provinces can't have less seats in the House of Commons than they have in the Senate. That's already a departure from representation by population. We know that rural areas tend to be weighted differently in order to ensure that there continues to be a strong rural representation in the House of Commons beyond what representation by population would dictate. Those are just a couple of examples of the way in which representation by population is not the only way that we determine representation in Canada. And so there are certainly precedents for looking at other departures from representation by population. And sometimes people get quite animated in this place about those debates. So we just saw an example of that. And we've seen examples from folks in other parties as well who get pretty animated. We've seen some very spirited defenses of representation by population, particularly from some of the Western Conservative members, and that's fair enough. We come here to represent our constituents and the points of view that people have on these matters, and they're rightly an object of concern. I do think it's important to try and have these debates with a little bit of humility, though, because they are very important and foundational debates. So, for instance, I look at the current Conservative leadership race, and I note with interest that in their own system, representation by population is not the rule. And fair enough, different parties do that differently. In the NDP, we have a one-member, one-vote system. We don't have any kind of weighting. In the Conservative Party, they've chosen to have a weighting. That's something that defies representation by population, presumably for good reason. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do that. I'm not saying that they should. What I'm saying is that they've made a choice to forgo strict representation by population because presumably they think it matters to try and have a proportionate weighting of voices from across the country in the selection of their leader. Also, when we talk about representation in this place, we sometimes talk about the voting system we have, and I've heard Conservatives take very strong positions on that, defending the balloting system that we have, defending the first-past-the-post system that we have. I note with interest, I believe that, and folks can correct me in the Q&A if I'm wrong, but that they're going to have a preferential ballot in the Conservative leadership race, something that they're very much against in other contexts, but have seen appropriate for their leadership. And not only are they going to have a preferential ballot, but they're going to have a preferential ballot that informs a proportional system, because leadership candidates will get a number of votes within their riding association proportionate to the percentage of votes that they got out of that system. And then presumably based on the alternative ballot, as some people fall off, then those votes will be redistributed within that riding to through that point system successively until they elect a leader. And I note also that they're doing this uniquely by mail-in ballot, which is something I listened to many Conservatives talk about in a filibuster at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee in the last Parliament, where they were very clear that they felt mail-in ballots led to fraudulent electoral outcomes. And so here we are, we have a Conservative Party that is using a preferential ballot in a non-representation by population system to have proportionate outcomes in a mail-in process, which is why I encourage us to speak to these issues here in the House with some humility. Because I think, in fact, depending on the context, various members do support different kinds of electoral principles. And I think it's why we should be able to have this conversation in a responsible way, in the way that I think Canadians would expect mature adults to try and have those conversations, not to demonize each other because of the kinds of positions that we're putting forward, but to try and hear what is important and of value in the other person's position, and then try to hammer out a compromise, as was the case originally in 1867. There were compromises made. They didn't satisfy everyone at the time, but that managed to move the Canadian project forward. And there have been many compromises since that haven't been perfect, certainly haven't pleased everyone. But Canada has been a constant activity and a constant project of trying to seek consensus and agreement. And as difficult as that is, I think it's actually Canada's strength. We live in a world right now that's rife with conflict. We live in a world right now where people are choosing to end conversation and negotiation in favor of polarization and violence. And one of the things that I think has been great about Canada, for all its many faults, because it's not a perfect place, has been its ability to even among very, very different peoples, different languages, different cultures, different histories, has been to find a way to take on these important questions of political representation and find a path towards compromise. We have a lot more work to do. We have work to do in the case of Quebec that continues to see its proportion of seats decline in the House of Commons, despite its special status within Confederation, with its own language and its own culture and its own history and its own contributions. We're also reckoning now, I think, in a much more vigorous way and appropriately so with Indigenous peoples. And there are questions of political representation that come up in respect of Indigenous peoples as well, something that we have not done a good job of at all in Canada in so many ways over the years. We have no kind of formal representation of Indigenous peoples in this place. There's no seats set aside. That is a conversation for another day too. But I think what's important about C-14 is that it is bringing people together from all sides of the chamber to recognize that while we have these larger debates that are important debates, and I do hope that we will find good ways of having those debates where we treat each other well and we work together on this project of constant negotiation that is Canada, that we at least can agree that we shouldn't be taking any step backward. And I think that at the very least, this law, if it should pass, will prevent us from taking steps backward, even as we try and find our way forward. We're not there yet. I think the debate around this bill has shown the extent to which we're not there in certain regards. But I do hope that I think it's been a positive exercise for this place to have occasion to talk about representation in Canada, what it does mean now, what it can mean in the future, and to have been able to do it in the context of a bill that, for all its imperfections and for all the legitimate criticism that there is of it, has largely brought people together, because I think it's allowed for a better and a more responsible conversation than we sometimes have in this place. And so I'm thankful for that. I'm anxious to see this bill pass quickly because of the time constraints we're under with the boundary redistribution process already taking place. And I hope that this is a down payment on a better debate about how Canada, as we head further into the 21st century, and we face many great challenges, both large challenges that are planetary in terms of climate change, but also real political challenges here at home, that this is a down payment on a better debate for how we find new and better ways of ensuring that all the voices of Canadians are represented in their right proportion here in the House of Commons to build a prosperous future for all of us. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires?
Questions and comments.
Electrical violence.
Thank you to my honourable colleague from Elwyn Transcona. I also have a chance to speak to C-14 later tonight. But as the conversation has been unfolding tonight, new ideas come to mind, and I'd like to try some out on the member for Elwyn Transcona. When we think about our friend, the member from Nunavut, spectacular member of Parliament, how can you can't get from Iqaluit to Inuvik without flying to southern Canada first, unless you're hiring a private plane. There may be the population is sparse, but the job is enormous. What would the honourable member think about us changing representation by population to something that includes funding for an individual MP reflective of what their actual costs are from serving the people of their riding? And this would apply to people, about half of the country, if you cut it off, about half of the territory of this enormous country is represented by 12 MPs. Their jobs are very different than the people who represent more concentrated southern Canadian populations.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I certainly do think that the question of how we resource MPs is a very important one, and recognizing that, depending on what riding you represent in the country, you're going to have a very different experience as an MP, and the community or communities that you serve are going to have very different experiences of having an MP, if you will. And so, there is already some provision made and some recognition of that disparity between different MPs depending on the nature of their riding. But it's certainly, I know, having heard from some of the members of our caucus who represent very large ridings, particularly in the north, that those resourcing conventions that we already have are inadequate to the task. You have only to sit down with them and talk about their experience to know that they're inadequate, and it is certainly something that we should be looking at trying to remedy.
Questions and comments, Honorable Deputy.
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to say to you that I really appreciated the Honourable Member's speech, but number one, because I respect him, and number two, because he did much of it in French. And we can also hear that he had the will to, he was showing openness. He wants to solve these problems that Quebec is experiencing. And sometimes it's hard to make the other members of Parliament hear reason. But he said that he would be ready to support a minimum threshold for Quebecers in this House, and I think that's a good thing. If all the members in this House could agree on that, then I think that it would make many Quebecers happy, and I think perhaps that it would make agreements easier to reach. But if I'm in politics, it's not because Quebec is not for Quebec to have 25% or any particular number. I know the NTB in the past had signed the Sherbrooke Declaration, saying that the self-determination of Quebec was fundamental, and I would like to know where his party stands on that issue right now. The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona. Do you mean on the matter of independence? The Sherbrooke Declaration. Well, since 1961, we have always supported the principle of asymmetric federalism. So perhaps I'm not understanding exactly what the member is talking about, but we have always tried to ensure that it is acknowledged that Quebec must have its own decision-making powers on its territory with regard to federal programs. That is always something that the NDP has sought to protect in our messaging. But I think, in my opinion, a confederation can work if everyone involved works together. It shouldn't just be the federal government telling the provinces what to do. The federal government should be rallying all provinces to work together, to negotiate in good faith, and to be there to provide funding to the provinces, as well as support for national projects that provinces will benefit from.